Everybody have a seat. We're about in another treat today. I think there's no other person who is held down as the cornerstone of this conference year after year like Gary Habermas, who's been here, I think, how many years now have you done this? Like forever. How many years? Yeah. Almost 20 years has been doing. I count Gary as a friend, and no one will answer the phone. As busy as he is, he will answer the phone every time I call him. An amazing, he is, you're looking at right now on the stage, and it's not me, the foremost expert in the resurrection in the world today. If you have not been to his website, you need to go. He'll tell you more about it. But you'll find everything. No one is writing more on the resurrection of Jesus than Gary is right now. So you have a distinct honor and privilege to hear him in person. I'm not going to take up any more of his space. This is Gary Habermas.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim. I hope I remember my lecture. This is about only my third time doing this one. But I do have a question for you. That was a serious comment. I do have a question. How many of you have heard the timeline lecture that I do? Oh, the hands are already going up. Oh, man. How many again? How many of you seen it? How many of you have seen it 5 times or more? How many of you have seen it 10 times or more? How many of you have seen it 15 times or more? Or getting down. How many of you have seen it 20 times or more? 1. There is a guy in England, I used to go over there every year, he had seen it 63 times. That's the record right now. Okay, all that to tell you this, I'm not doing that today. But I'm doing a wee little piece of it, but we're going to zero in on a little piece very specifically. The timeline argument, and I'll be making use of this, I usually walk across the whole front, but I don't need it. Today, it's shorter. And that would be creation down there, and that's 2022 down there. And on that chart, we put the death of Jesus at 30 AD, and we moved down to the Gospels, then back to the early years. And when you do history, generally speaking, there's 2 kinds of data you want up front. Early data and eyewitness data. Now, if you've ever been a reporter or a journalist, you know the importance of early eyewitness data. That you can have one without the other. You can have an early report that's hearsay, and it's not eyewitness. You can have an eyewitness report that's not early. And my example of that, you say, well, how could it be if the person's an eyewitness? Well, here's an example. I always remember the story of a man who fought in World War II, so you think in 1940s, and he did his memoirs of World War II in the early 90s. That's 50 years later. Eyewitness, yes. Early, no. And it's better to get somebody who recalls better. You can look for backup from what they're saying. There's a lot of other tests for historicity. It's a big subject on how you write history. But early and eyewitness are 2 of the best evidences. Now, here's what I want to talk about today, and that is 5 events from 30 AD up to 36 AD. So it's just a real small piece of the timeline. And I'm going to have a little break in there that's not one of the 5, but I want to talk about something else that's going on at the same time. So that's the whole lecture. 5 things and what's going on when these 5 started. Because it's fascinating and it's new, and you almost won't see it anywhere unless you know where to look. So let's start like this. According to most scholars, Jesus died by crucifixion in 30 AD. The second most popular year is not 29 or 31. The second most popular year is 33. And you remember that this time of year when you go out and look at the moon and so on, because you have to get the Passover right to get the crucifixion right. So 33 is the second most popular year. And there are actually some pretty major scholars who go for 33, but it's irrelevant. Because you can call it ground zero as far as I'm concerned. We're going to work from ground zero to see what are the early eyewitness sources. Okay. Now, a couple problems right away. A lot of Christians hear this. This is the way they argue, and this is why critics complain. They'll say, But Matthew says, and Mark says, and Luke says, and John says, and the person goes, illegitimate, circular argument, I'm not accepting your. Why? You're using prejudiced sources. How so? Well, those are Christian sources. You wouldn't like what I was doing if I gave you all atheist sources. Okay, let's start again. Where's your data? And a lot of Christians are frozen at that point. They don't know what to do. They could say, hey, how about some arguments that the Gospels are reliable? Well, I think that's great. You can use reliability arguments, but reliability arguments take a long time to develop. Who are the authors? What do you do with so-called contradictions? The number one most common critique from 1799 until the present, 1799 is the beginning of what was called German liberalism, by a book called On Religion by Friedrich Schleiermacher, a German liberal. And from that time to date, and even a little before him, the most common objection to Christians is your Gospels contain contradictions. And our comeback is, oh no, I've got these books on my shelf that deal with contradictions, and some of them are really, really good. And they are. They're really, really good. But if you start playing that, I won't call it a game, but if you start going like that, they're going to keep going until you don't remember one, or one's not in the book, or whatever. And some of them are quite pithy, to be honest with you. But here's the question. From 1799 until the present, how come a lot of people, including critics, believe in the resurrection and they still believe there's contradictions in the Gospels? Now, I'm not saying that's your view, but I'm asking, and it's not mine. You know where I teach, so you know my view. But they think there are problems in the Gospels. It doesn't keep them from accepting the resurrection. So it's not a great objection. It's like something to stump Christians or something, or they think it's a good objection, but it's not. Let me give you an example. If you're doing a report on the Revolutionary War, and you go to your favorite library, university library, and you're getting all this data, and you're hearing interviews with people, and someone says, oh, that testimony from George Washington is bogus. He never cut down a cherry tree and said he won't lie. That's bogus. Oh, are you using? You are? Oh, that's bogus too. But I'll bet you can still turn in a good paper on what happened during the Revolutionary War. Bogus stories won't take the pithiness out of the story. You'll still have enough. Everybody has to deal with problems. And so if you have a shelf of books on the Revolutionary War and George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, they can have problems in it. And you can still get a history. Bart Ehrman, the famous, probably best known atheist New Testament scholar, he says, when I use stories about the life of Jesus, I'm going to get some things from the Gospels. Now, I'm an atheist, and I don't believe the Gospels are reliable. So you're asking me why I'm using this data. And I'm using these data because they are the earliest sources for this, what we're talking about. And then he gives this example. If I'm doing a report on the Revolutionary War, if I could interview George Washington, I would be glad to do so, even though he's prejudiced. Of course he won that big battle. Of course he exaggerated how many of the British he killed. Of course. But we can study these things and find out what's going on. So there's ways to deal with problems. And Bart Ehrman himself said, there's a lot of things in the Gospels that are historical, even if you think there's issues. Now just keep these things in mind, because I'm going to work through them and tell you why they're not issues. Okay? Bart Ehrman himself. Let me go down here, and let's call this the crucifixion. We're working this way for 5 points. Bart Ehrman gives 15 independent sources for the crucifixion of Jesus within 100 years, which he thinks is a fair period of time for ancient history. 100 sources for Jesus' crucifixion for over 100 years. Now, the earliest biographies of Alexander the Great are just short of 300 years later. 300. The earliest biographies and writings about Buddha are mostly 600 to 800 years after he died. And I could go on and on, but these aren't bad examples. These are two of the best examples. Alexander in history and Buddha in religion. And Bart Ehrman says, no, the Gospels are a lot closer than that. They're only decades away. And even the last of them, John, is within my 100-year limit. You could go from 30 to 130. John's way before that. So this is good. We can learn a lot about, and you wonder, so you do think there's facts about Jesus, even though you think there's discrepancies? Yeah, in fact, I think there's mostly discrepancies, but I think we can learn a lot about Jesus. Okay, that's where I'm going to start here. Now, next principle. I'm going to use what I call a minimal facts argument, which says, well, I play around with my students and I'll say, minimal facts argument is a heads I win, tails you lose argument. But here's how the minimal facts argument works. I'm only going to use data today that have two characteristics. Number one, they're multiply evidenced on many, many levels. I'm only going to use 6. They're not anything to do with these 5. I mean, these are mixed in with them, but I'm not unpacking those 6. They're multiply evidenced. In fact, we just finished, if some of you know I'm doing a magnum opus on the resurrection, right now it's 5,300 pages long. The first volume just went to the publishers yesterday. I pushed the button. I'm telling you what, I'm in a good mood. For the first time in several years, I can ask this question. What am I going to be doing on Monday? So I'm excited. But since I just did this volume, it's on the evidence for Jesus. I spent 400 pages on these minimal facts. There's only 6 of them. And most of them, virtually all of them, I have to stop and think, have between 15 and 30 evidences for each one. And I'm using the critics' rules for finding evidence. Why do you think the second rule is true? Nobody argues with them. Now, I'm not talking about guys who believe Jesus never lived, but they don't have a college degree. And I know you can be very smart and never go to college. I know that. But I'm talking about people who have terminal degrees in relevant areas to New Testament research, New Testament theology, history, the classics, archaeology. You talk this language, you know the data. And even with that group, there's 15 to 30-ish reasons to believe each of these facts. So once again, I'm only going to use facts which the critics admit, which is A, because there's many evidences for them, therefore the critics allow them. All right, I'm only going to use those. So we talked about doing history. We want early eyewitness, but I'm going to get there the way they get there. And I'm not going to use problematic text by definition of what critics call a problematic text. I won't even use those. I'm going to use the ones we establish. And I want to argue that from this date in 30 AD up to 36, there are 5 events which virtually every scholar agrees to. Now let me make something very, very clear. They're not true because scholars agree to them. I don't care how many PhDs they have, how long they've been teaching, what schools they teach in. They're true because the data say they're true. And then, as an extra aside, much less important, but it's there, everyone allows it. In fact, many critics whose names you would know have responded to me here or there, and they'll say, I don't have any problem with this facts. And someone will say, but I wouldn't use the empty tomb. Well, I'll say something. I've never used the empty tomb. The empty tomb is great evidence, but I don't use it as any of my minimal facts. So if you hear anybody say that, they're just misrepresenting my work. Never has been part of it. So I'm going to use 5 facts that have many reasons each, which critics say is true. And here's what I want you to answer. How can you hear this much data and not have a resurrection from these facts? How do you get out of it? Now, if you're a critic, your job is not to say, well, I got this problem with how many women went to the tomb. It's irrelevant. Well, how many angels were there? Well, what are you talking about? Like where there's 1, 15, 40, or what? All 4 Gospels have either 1 or 2. I mean, it's not very, big discrepancy here. Not discrepancy at all, technically. I'm not talking about that stuff. But what are you going to do with this evidence? How are you going to come up against this? Okay, that's it. All right, now I told you before I began the 5 in 6 years, I wanted to start with the trend that scholars are just discovering. If you know what books to go to, it's been out for a few years. But some of the latest stuff is this. For the longest time, and evangelicals don't even kick about this often. They'll say, if this is when Jesus died, and the Gospel of John is written way down there where the seats end, because John's written like 65 years later, they'll say, it is true that John has a higher Christology than the other Gospels. And critics would say that's because the story keeps getting bigger and bigger over time. The evangelicals would say, no, Jesus was so heavy in his comments that it took them a long time to unpack these things. Now, a well-known New Testament scholar, Raymond Brown, in the 1990s, made a comment and went something like this. If Jesus would have returned in the 1990s and read the Gospel of John, he would have said, that's where I was going. In other words, it took the church that long to unpack this heavy, heavy stuff. I mean, you talk about monotheistic Jews who don't believe God has a son in any kind of ontological sense, and he's claiming deity, and that's heresy, and then you realize that Jesus was killed for it, and the book of Deuteronomy says, cursed is the man who hangs on a tree. There's a lot of problems here. Paul said it's a stumbling block. The crucifixion is a stumbling block. So, what are you going to do with all this? But now the field has switched, and most scholars, I think most of the guys who are on the cutting edge, and they could be critics, they don't think we have to go down to John. This is a famous phrase that is being noised abroad right now. It was said by a scholar or two, and now it's being said more widely. I want you to think about this. It's heavy, heavy, heavy stuff. Jesus dies, and the comment is, the earliest Christology is the highest Christology. Go, what? The earliest Christology is the highest Christology. The highest material on Jesus comes out here. So soon? Yep. And what does that involve? Well, this high Christology includes the following. Yes, Jesus was born of Mary, and he lived about 30 years, but he was pre-existent. He lived with his Father from the beginning. Wow, that's heavy. Pre-existence, that's heavy. Here's another one. Many passages say that he sat on the right hand of God. Whoa. When he's before the high priest in Mark 14, which may be the best verses for the deity of Christ in the Gospels, Mark 14, 61 to 64. The high priest says to him, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? And he's using Jewish language because he doesn't want to mention God's name. Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? Are you the Messiah, Christ, the Son of God? And Jesus says, now he spoke Aramaic, but of course your New Testament, your Gospels are in Greek. And in the Greek, Jesus says, ego eimi, I am. All right, the high priest probably thinking we're getting somewhere here. Because remember, he brought the other witnesses in, he'll destroy the temple, and he made them all leave because they didn't think they were good arguments. Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? Just mano a mano, just tell me to my face. I'm tired of this cutting up stuff. Do you believe you're the Christ, the Son of God? Ego eimi, I am. Now there are discussions about this, whether that comment was the same as the I am of Exodus 3. That's another loaded comment. Most people think it's not. He's probably just saying yes. But the first problem is, for the Jewish high priest, he said, I am. Second problem, and henceforth you'll see the Son of Man. Now, the high priest should go, whoa. I ask you if you are the Christ, the Son of God, and you're giving me the Son of Man language? Come on, haven't you read the Psalms? The Son of Man is a man. Hello. What good does it do to answer my question by saying, I'm a man? He doesn't do that. You know why he doesn't? Son of Man is as high a title of deity as Son of God is, at least arguably. So, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? Yes, I am. Henceforth, you'll see the Son of Man. He says, coming on the clouds. Time out. The only person who comes on the clouds in the Old Testament is God. So these guys are getting hot under the collar. Ego and me, henceforth you'll see the Son of Man coming on the clouds and seated on the right hand of God. That's a no-no. In fact, most commentators think that's the one he said that was the most offensive to them. Seated on the right hand of God. Remember, pre-existent, right hand of God, and he was worshipped. Well, they don't want that last thing to come. So they say he's a blasphemer. And you know the story. He goes over to Pilate and he dies. But that high Christology is there. A lot of people think that the minute, it might be a few days, it might be a week. You know, Pentecost doesn't come for 50 days, so it could have been a couple months. But pretty soon, right after the death of Jesus, a high Christology is being preached in the book of Acts. I know this stuff's heavy, but just track with me, and I think it'll all come out for you. And in these early Acts sermon summaries that people think, not the book of Acts, but the sermon summaries date to the 30s AD. 30s AD, critics think. Jesus is called Lord. That's a real no-no, because Adonai is the translation of the Old Testament word for Yahweh. Now, I am not saying that, as I was accused by a New Testament critic just recently of saying, I'm not saying Jesus and Yahweh are numerically the same person. Christian doctrine is same nature, three persons. We don't say the Son is the Father. I mean, that would be hopeless, it'd be heresy. But Lord is a very lofty phrase, and it's what was used for Jehovah in the Old Testament. I'm just saying, whatever that parses out to, this is pretty heavy stuff. And Jesus said, I'll be sitting in the right hand of God. And coming out of the gates right here, pretty soon, we find evidence for the following minimum two things. Worship of Jesus starts right away. Didn't wait till John. Remember, they pick up stones in John when they think he's claiming to be God. They pick up stones. But see, John, that would be back there, right, during Jesus' earthly ministry. So they pick up stones to kill him. But in the early church, he's being worshipped. It's blasphemy. He said he would be seated on the right hand of God. And the church also believed he existed from eternity past, even though he was born to Mary at a point in time. That's heavy stuff. But the church began to teach these things here, not there. They taught him down there. You can find it in the Gospel of John, but notice my language. They began to teach it here. They didn't begin to teach it down there. You all with me so far? This is just the intro. Very high Christology, a little bit about how to do history, early in eyewitnesses, and high Christology. Now, I've got a question for you. We're starting the 5 arguments. 5 arguments in 6 years. What shot this message out of the canon from right here? Jesus is dead. Now, he said he was going to be right hand of God, Son of Man, but he died. Cursed is the man who hangs on a tree. He died. What good is what he said before? That Saturday after the cross, if you believe in a Friday crucifixion, by the way, the 3 days and 3 nights, that's a euphemism. It's not something for you to parse off. Do you know you can never get exactly 3 days and 3 nights no matter what day you make the crucifixion? But here's a better comeback. In the Old Testament, there are 2 texts. One says 3 days later, and the other one says 3 days and 3 nights. Both examples are the day after tomorrow, because Jews count any part of a day as a full day. So, Jesus is dead. Something starts this stuff in a few months. It's shot out of a cannon. They were bold. They said we ought to obey God rather than man. They were whipped and beaten up early on in the book of Acts. Stephen is stoned. He's not one of the 12, but Stephen is stoned. And a few chapters later, James, the brother of John, the son of Zebedee, not the brother of Jesus, but the brother John, is, they think, beheaded. It says he was killed by the sword, which usually is a phrase for he was beheaded, the way the Romans did it, but the way the Romans beheaded. They didn't use an axe or a guillotine or anything like that. So things are already happening. And we learned in the early chapters of Acts that everybody scattered except for the 12. I mean, things were going on here and it was heavy. But they're carrying a message for them. Why were they that willing? They were transformed to the point of being willing to die, and some of them did. You can't prove all the apostles died, not from early sources. But they're willing to. You go, well, how do you know they were willing to? You can't read their minds. I'm not reading their minds. I'm reading their shoes. Sandals. Here's how you get that. If I go into a city where I was beat up the last time I went, and I have some followers there, and I want to check up on the church, and I have what it takes to go back in that city again, I'm taking my life in my own hands. Especially if I was stoned like Paul was at Lystra. And so something's happening here. My question again is, what's the canon that shoots this stuff out, revolutionizes Christology? And yeah, it's in the pre-Christian Jesus, ego on me, henceforth you'll see the Son of Man coming out of the clouds, seated on the right hand of God. And like I said, one is they're worshiping him out here, a little bit, who knows how long. They're worshiping him, very short time. And secondly, they're using Old Testament texts that refer to Yahweh, and they're applying them to Jesus. Isn't that blasphemy? Isaiah, I will not share my glory with anybody else. And they're willingly sharing it with Jesus, his own disciples. What's going on? Something shot this out of a cannon. And here's the answer in one word. It's the resurrection. Now, I know you know that, but picture the kind of boom this would be. He said he was going to rise again. He made all kinds of incredible claims. I didn't know what to think. Remember Peter? Peter kind of had a habit of putting his foot in his mouth a little bit, but Peter said, no, I'll go with you to the death. It'll never happen. And then, of course, Peter has a sword in the garden and slices off the ear of the servant, and Jesus heals him. Peter said, I'll be there with you from the beginning. They misunderstood him. And they thought he meant something else. What happened on Friday when he died? Saturday is a very bad day in church history. It's often called Black Saturday. A lot of depression. I don't know about you guys. I told you I have a decision on what I want to do on Monday. The disciples had that decision. Some of them decided to go fishing. I don't know, maybe Matthew said, I think there's still a place for me tax collecting. I don't know. But, hate to say it, but guys, does this seem like a failed prophet to you? Oh, don't say that, I can't think about this. What was that Saturday like? And then they see him on Sunday. And their emotions and their message exploded. And we have them saying, right here, he's pre-existent, he's seated on God's right hand, and he's to be worshiped. We can take the Old Testament verses that apply to Jehovah and apply them to Jesus. So what 5 things happened after the resurrection went off, after the canon went off? Okay, here's number 1. Most of you are going to know probably 3 of these 5. They're going to sound like old hat, but I want to put them in a line for you so you know that these are very hard objections to answer if you're a critic. Number 1, James, the brother of Jesus, becomes a believer. This is important. Mark chapter 3, Mark chapter 6, John chapter 7 all say the brothers of Jesus were not believers. In fact, John says it explicitly. The brothers did not believe. It's much harsher in Mark 3 and Mark 6. The townspeople and the brothers seem to agree in the text. The townspeople think Jesus is mentally disturbed. The Greek says that he was beside himself. Sort of like, I don't know, schizophrenic, two of you. I don't know, but it wasn't a nice complaint. They thought he was nuts. And the brothers apparently tried to get him out of the way so you're not an embarrassment to the family. They're not believers. So what happens? As far as we know, we get to the cross and James doesn't believe. Now this next point, I can only make an inference. I don't have any, it's just a thoughtful comment. I don't have any evidence. But on the cross in the book of John, John commits his mother to whom? I'm sorry, Jesus commits his mother to, okay, guess what? John. Why didn't he give his mother to James? Now it could be a real simple answer. James just wasn't there. No, it explains a little bit. He's embarrassed by Jesus. Yeah. The cross is embarrassment. Anybody can read Deuteronomy. I just don't have any reason to be around. It could be that simple. But it could be because Jesus wanted to commit his mother to someone who believed. Now, don't know about that. But Jesus comes back. Luke says he was on the earth for 40 days appearing. It's the only place we get that in the New Testament is in Acts chapter 1. And then Jesus ascends. A few days later is Pentecost. Plus 50 days. And there's an event there in chapter 1 right after Jesus ascends, and we call it the upper room. There were about 120 people there trying to digest all of this, but they know Jesus had been raised and they've seen him go, and presumably he'll come back, but we won't see him, or at least not for a while. Actually, Jesus told his disciples at one point in Luke, you will want me to return. You will want this, and you will not see that day. So for those who say Jesus was mistaken about the time of his return, I mean, he says in Mark 13, I don't know that day or hour. He tells the disciples they will not see the event. And so they're sad because he's gone, but they're overjoyed because he's raised. Well, guess who's in the upper room? Mary and the boys. I got a hard time thinking, he might have been a seeker at that point, but I have a hard time thinking he's going through all this and that kind of an about face, and he's not a believer yet. He may not have been. He might be very close. But I got a feeling James's conversion comes between the cross and that upper room experience. He's got about 50 days there, or a little afterwards. It's not Pentecost yet, but we weren't told it's exactly after that point. So he's got over 40 days, let's say, to be in the fold. And he believes because he saw the risen Jesus. The cannon kind of caught him in its fire, and he realized if he were raised from the dead, all the stuff that I made fun of and didn't believe was apparently false, and I'm the false, not really prophet, but I'm the false teacher. Okay? So James's conversion is huge, given Mark 3, Mark 6, John 7, which is also scripture. Okay, second point. There's a word in the New Testament, homologia. Now, logia, if you know anything about Greek, logia means sayings. Homologia has to do with the earliest message to which everybody agreed. This is the early material that everybody agrees to. Of the homologia is centered around who Jesus was and what he did, what we call Christology. And as some of the best experts on this have written, that these events always include these three. He's deity, he died, he was raised from the dead. Now you can pack that out theologically. He's deity. How do you claim that? Well, Son of God, there's Son of Man, and so on. There's Lord. Secondly, he died. You can add for our sins. You can unpack this theology. He was raised bodily. So you can unpack these things. But deity, death, resurrection was the homologia. Homologia means, again, the earliest message which is most surely to be believed among all of us. This is the center of the Christian message. And it was taught immediately. It's used in the New Testament as this early message. Okay, so we're getting out of the gate here. Just before it's over, Jesus is dead, but before it's over, the cannon goes off, fires everybody up, inspires them for the future, and James is in the fold. Number two, when they do start preaching, they start preaching about the homologia, that early material which is of central and common consent. Okay, third, at this time, there are some what we call creedal traditions. Now, this takes a little bit of explaining. The creedal traditions, scholars think that Jesus' audiences included 70 to 90% of his hearers that were illiterate. No offense, but they couldn't write their name. They appreciated hearing his oral message or try to pack it as best they can, but they can't write their name. They're illiterate. Now, in education today, we know how to teach people who are illiterate. We start teaching them early, right? We teach them the ABCs. You can put these in short words. Put them in a short sentence. You can teach them little nursery rhymes. They can't write their name, but they know secular examples like row, row, row your boat gently down the stream. Now, it rhymes, so when they go home to tell their folks what they learned today, they remember this little thing, or at least parts of it. Here's a religious example. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found, but was blind, but now I see. You can be illiterate, not be able to sign your name, and to be able to say, row, row, row your boat, and or, amazing grace, how sweet the sound, and not be able to write your name. The way you do this is to teach these little ditties that people can remember. Now, for us, I dare say, amazing grace, how sweet the sound is more important than row, row, row your boat or Jack and Jill went up the hill. But they can teach a person to read. They're important, they have their place. But the gospel goes out, if you teach it the right way, you teach kindergartners about the gospel, or to say the books of the Bible, and you teach them these things. So the next step there, the third step, are these creeds. And these creeds are very, very early. Very, very early. How early? Well, some people believe these creeds, these creedal statements, we have many of them in the New Testament. There are dozens in our epistles. Rarely in the Gospels, but many of them in the epistles. Here's a great example. After John 3:16, one of the next few most memorized verses. Romans 10:9. If you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God's raised him from the dead, you'll be saved. Now notice, Lord, the word not the same person as Jehovah, but the same word that is used to translate Jehovah. There's some significance there. Died, well, he rose, and because he died, that's the way the verse runs. If you confess that Jesus is Lord, believe in your heart that God has raised him from the dead. That's one of them. How about 1 Corinthians 11? Many of you read it in your church, one Sunday every month, or some of you do it every Sunday. I deliver unto you, Paul says, that which I also received from the Lord. That, and here comes the communion. He took the bread, he blessed it, he gave thanks. It is my body which is broken for you. Notice the atonement and the gospel are right in there. This do in remembrance of me. Took the cup after. This is my blood shed for you. We're still in the gospel. This do in remembrance of me. Some scholars think that that early creed goes back to Jesus himself. Paul says, I gave you, that's what I also received from the Lord. So it could have been creedalized from that early meal just before the crucifixion. This is exciting stuff. But there's many, many creeds in the New Testament. One of the most exciting ones is 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 to 7. And it starts out like 1 Corinthians 11. And Paul says, I delivered unto you that which I also received. See, if this were modern writing, he'd have to put a footnote here. He said, I got this from somebody else. This is an ancient footnote. I delivered unto you that which I also received. how that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, there's the gospel again, buried, rose again the third day, and appeared to Peter and the 12. And in this list, you have two individuals, Peter and James, the brother of Jesus, and three groups, the 12, 500, and a group called all the apostles, which all scholars come up with. This is a group. Remember, apostles were chosen because they shared in the resurrection appearances, but they're larger than the 12. So three groups. The best evidenced appearance of Jesus, just an aside, the best evidence appearance of Jesus is to the 12. So Luke 24, it's in John 20, twice in John 20 if you count stage 2 when Thomas is there. It's in the Creed. It's in the Acts sermon summaries. And we get this data really early. So a lot of scholars think these creeds were in existence before Paul got to Damascus, and he was probably angry. The creeds probably really got him upset. It's the stuff that Jesus was killed for back to the days of the trial. He's a blasphemer. Paul's Orthodox, Jewishly Orthodox. And he doesn't believe this. He's Pharisee, the conservatives. And he's probably on his way to do something. Why was he sitting there holding the coats for those who stoned Stephen? Don't tell me he didn't hear Stephen's sermon. Go back and read it in Acts 7. Don't tell me he didn't hear some of that. Don't tell me he didn't know what these people believed. As scholars allow, whatever you do with the Creedal thing, statements about Jesus were all over the place prior to Paul's conversion, including statements about his crucifixion, death, and resurrection. They were there. And the Jesus Seminar, if you know this group, how many of you know what the Jesus Seminar is? And a lot of you. These are the guys that throw the beads in the hat, and red means something happened, pink means it probably happened, gray means probably not, and black means no way. They do this creed. And Paul says, last of all, he appeared to me. You know what color they count that? Red. The creed starts out, he appeared to Peter and the 12. What's Peter? Pink, probably. And the Jesus Seminar guys, very, very critical scholars. They go, you know why Peter's pink and Paul is red? Because we have Paul's comment. He's an eyewitness. We don't have Peter saying he saw Jesus. If we had Peter saying he saw Jesus, it'd be red. But we only have the creed saying he saw Jesus. So we think it's probably pretty liable. We call it pink. And then they added a footnote. The women saw him too. So right away you have, for starters, you have Paul, Peter, and the women saying yes. He appeared. Well, the Jesus Seminar, that same group, they voted as a group that 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7, at least the material in it, predates Paul's conversion. So if you're watching, Jesus dies in 30 AD. The explosion happens that weekend. It's around for 40 days. The preaching's being taught. Paul's getting angry. Paul hears the teaching. The disciples James comes to the Lord. Probably the critics didn't even notice. James came to the Lord. Preaching starts. Paul's getting angrier, like when he holds Stephen's coat and he hears everybody talk about it. And now he's on his way to Damascus, and critics put this at unanimously. Doesn't make any difference if you believe or unbeliever. Just be a scholar. And they put this event at 2 to 3 years after the cross. 2 to 3 years after the cross. He's on the way to Damascus. Who knows what he's thinking? Probably blasphemous thoughts about blasphemous people. And another cannon. Jesus appears out of nowhere to Paul. And Paul becomes a believer. That's a huge event. And it's number 4. James, the earliest preaching. Gerrit Ludemann, he just passed away recently, but a German atheist New Testament scholar who said the preaching of the appearances of Jesus happened immediately after the events. That's homologia. The creeds start, and this creed starts sometimes. Some of them are pre-Pauline. There's different senses of pre-Pauline, but they're before Paul's conversion. Many scholars believe that by the time of his conversion, they're well into swing. And then the fifth event here, probably it's a majority. Several scholars say it's the consensus New Testament view today. It's the consensus New Testament view among critics that when Paul went to Jerusalem, he gives you the date, Galatians 1, the critics love the book. They'll let you quote it all day long. Paul said he went up to Jerusalem a mere 3 years later. And he's preaching. Now, I don't know what happened to my time, but my clock disappeared. I think that means I probably better wrap this up, and I got a right time and a wrong time, and one of them's right and one of them's wrong. So I'll say quickly, Paul goes to Jerusalem in Galatians chapter 1. He spends 15 days with Peter and James. Bingo, whose names are in that list? Peter and James, and Paul says, last of all, he appeared to me. They're all there for 15 days. What's the theme of the gospel, of the book of Galatians? It's all about the gospel. You get it too big, it's heresy. You get it too small, it's heresy. You got to get it just right. Minimum, deity, death, resurrection of Jesus. That's the gospel facts. Then what do you do with it? If you said, I do to Jesus, that's the message. And they're talking about it for 15 days. Here's my first question to them if I'm Paul. Hey, if you guys tell me what you thought on Easter Sunday morning when Jesus appeared to you and broke that depression of Saturday, I'll tell you what happened when Jesus appeared to me on the way to Damascus, and I realized that what all these Christians were preaching was true. Let's compare notes. I've not heard this from you guys. I've not heard it from your own mouths. Tell me what it was like to be in that room and you saw your Lord, and I'll tell you what it was like when I was struck and blinded for a few days. And almost everybody, consensus New Testament view, it all came together this date at the latest. It's all here. Now, Paul goes back to Jerusalem 14 years later, Galatians 2, and they specifically ask about the gospel content, and all the apostles agreed on the date. In fact, 1 Corinthians 15:11 repeats it from Paul's viewpoint. And he said, whether it's I or them, this is what we all teach. We all teach the same thing. That's important. That's back to the homologia. That's what they all taught. And it's not what they all taught about Jesus. Jesus was born in Bethlehem and grew up in Nazareth. No, what they all agreed on was deity, death, and resurrection. Nazareth is fine, but deity, death, and resurrection. Folks, by this date, we have these 5 events, and they're powerful, they're historical. Critics grant them. You're going to have to look hard to find critics who don't admit any of them. We got all 5, we got more coming. He made another trip. We got the later creeds. The thing we know about the creeds, they were all written before the epistles, because that's when they're written down for the first time. But they were pronounced orally. Who can refute these 5 events? You pick a naturalistic theory? Critics don't pick naturalistic theory so much anymore today. Bart Ehrman said he remembers the days when he was evangelical. He used to like people to pick naturalistic theories because the facts slaughtered them. He said, so today I don't pick naturalistic theories anymore. I just say these things don't happen. These things don't happen according to your worldview. But this is a world where things do happen. Just heard today from a well-known skeptic that 1/3 of all atheists and agnostics believe in an afterlife. Figure that one out. I'm not making fun of them. I'm saying, where does it come from on their philosophy? If you believe in an afterlife, why are you dogging my view of the resurrection, which is the afterlife? So if I have data and you have none, I think you have a personal problem. Seriously, it's your worldview that won't let you say, well, you guys are prejudiced. Well, everybody's prejudiced. That's another way to say we're all sinners. I mean, we're all prejudiced. But here's the difference. We have all the data. They have none. There are no evidences that establish atheism. None. Ask them. Ask your favorite atheist. How do you know atheism is true? See what they tell you. They usually say, I don't have to give you any evidences. I only have to tell you that I'm not you. That's what I mean by atheism, I'm not you. Yeah, right, but you told me you're something, and when you make an assertion that you're something, you got to give me data for it. What's your data? I don't want to talk about this. I guess you don't. So I'll end with this thought. Only 5 of these events from that long timeline that I usually do here. Concentrating these 5, they're easy to master. You can give them any Sunday school class, you can give them to a Bible study group. But since the Christianity is based on the deity, death, resurrection of Christ, and whether somebody said I do to that view of Jesus, and by the way, you don't say I do to the history, you say to the Jesus about whom the history is true. When you get married, you don't say I do to good looks, smart, fun to be with, I love the jokes. You don't marry those things. You marry the person who is those things. Oh, and I'm really glad they're a Christian. Oh, wow. Well, that's huge. But you marry the person who is those things. And when you say yes to Jesus, you say yes to a person. You're not saying yes to history. Deity, death, resurrection, what do you do with them? That's the facts of the gospel. It's all early. 5 events by 36 AD. Compare that to Buddha or Alexander or anybody else. Folks, we have the gospel. Only those who have a worldview without data don't like it. And we have all the data.